Welcome. My name is Paige, and we are here as part of Deschutes Public Library's virtual programming. I'm joined tonight by Dr. Lydia Kang and Nate Pedersen, and we are going to be talking about a really close to our hearts subject, some of the world's deadliest diseases. Before we begin this presentation, though, a couple of key things to note. We have disabled the chat for tonight's presentation. And so we will be using the Q&A to take all of your questions. You can put those questions into the Q&A at any time. We'll be answering questions throughout the program and then save some time at the end for any last minute things that you are dying to know. We also have tonight with us our ASL interpreter, Miss Morton, and thank you so much to her for joining us tonight. There are options. If you would prefer to see speaker view, you can click just the upper right-hand corner, the view button, and you can toggle between either speaker view and gallery view if you would prefer to see only speakers. All right. Our panelists tonight are Dr. Lydia Kang. She is an author and internal medicine physician. She is a graduate of Columbia University and New York University School of Medicine. She completed her training at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. She lives with her family in the Midwest. And Nate Pedersen is a writer, anthologist, and historian in Portland, Oregon. Nate's nonfiction has appeared in Mental Floss, The Guardian, Trail Runner, The Art of Manliness, Powell's Books, and The Believer. Thank you so much to Nate and Lydia for joining me tonight to talk about their book, Patient Zero, A History of the World's Deadliest Diseases. All right, you two, let's just go ahead and get started with you telling us a little bit about how you got started on this really interesting topic. How did this book come about? Give us a little bit of backstory, if you will.
Sure. So first of all, thank you all so much for having us here tonight. Thank you, Ray and Paige, for making this all happen. Really appreciate it. I guess starting to talk about how Patient Zero happens starts with our first book, which is Quackery, A Brief History of the Worst Ways to Cure Everything. And I usually have a copy with me nearby, but I don't right now. So we wrote that book. It came out in 2017, and we have been thinking about how to come up with a follow-up book for that. So in 2019, we spoke to our editor, John at Workman Publishing, and floating around a bunch of different ideas. And we decided to do pandemics and how diseases break out, cause all sorts of problems, how we figured out what they even were, that sort of a thing. Nate, you want to talk a little bit about whether or not we planned this to be a pandemic book when the pandemic came out?
Yeah, so that was an interesting thing about the creation, the writing of this book. So the idea for Patient Zero and the idea to kind of use the narrative lens of telling the story of the first person that in some epidemics got the disease is kind of like your way into a broader story about an infectious disease in its place in history. So that idea came about right at the same time that the world first heard about COVID, including us as the writers. So when the book sold to Workman, we had heard of COVID. And at that time, it was still strictly limited to Wuhan, China, and the whole world was kind of waiting to see what was going to happen next, right? And at that point in time, if you all can kind of recollect that little window of time anyway, that was well before a global pandemic was thought a likelihood. It was still like, I suppose some outlier thinkers were thinking it could head in that direction, but it seemed like it wasn't going to be all that big of a deal. And then, of course, that was not the case. And here we are 3 years later, and we're still, in the midst of it. So thus the composition of the book. So the way nonfiction works is oftentimes you'll sell a book on proposal. So you'll sell like the idea and a few chapters, and that's what sold. And then we were composing the book and writing about all of these horrible diseases throughout time, while then having this real experience of also living through a pandemic of global proportions, right? And of course, COVID then became a major chapter in the book, which Lydia wrote.
So Lydia, you wrote the major chapter of COVID, and what did you do to kind of bring the research aspect to that portion of the book? Was it different from your traditional means of researching? I think that it was more of like a present adventure into like how how you are actually dealing with it in the timely manner. And I know that much of the book is about, you know, history that is long past the Black Plague. It's something that is dead and gone for the most part. How did you do the research for COVID while it was ongoing?
So it was really difficult because it wasn't until it was probably the last chapter that I wrote, first of all. And the reason for that was there was so much information that was still constantly ongoing about just unfolding about what we knew about the disease. And so the needle sort of kept moving as far as where it was pointing towards what should I actually write about. So once we kind of decided, it was sort of obvious after the fact, maybe even before the fact, but I couldn't see it at the time, that we should start at the beginning, right? So how COVID actually unfolded, but more so the topic was the politicalization of pandemics. So we ended up doing the research on how the discovery of COVID unfolded in China, the WHO's response to it, the United States response to it. But a lot of that information is very colored by whoever's telling the narrative, right? And so I had to dig through the nuance of that and try to find actual facts, but then find where, you know, different governments were trying to cloud the facts of this and the facts of that. So that was really interesting. You know, some of my sources were Chinese newspapers, which I couldn't read. And so I had to get, you know, those sources in ways that I had to. It was kind of weird. And I also had to use resources that actually came from, you know, our federal government that had like a really great timeline that was incredibly well researched itself. And so I ended up fact checking the timeline that the United States had to see if I could get it right and make sure that all their numbers and their dates matched up and things like that. So it was really interesting. It was very challenging as well, because we wanted to keep it a very even keel viewpoint, but at the same time, it means, you know, shedding light on things that really weren't pleasant to look at, you know, about how China at one point in time, you know, had the virus in their hands. They had the genetic code and they squashed it down for days at a time, or were trying to destroy it so that they could come out with the genetic code at the right time, but from the right agency, as if they had done it from the get-go and it was always them. So that was really upsetting to see and to hear about. That's just one example of things that were sort of surprising and unhappily so in writing that chapter.
That sounds harrowing. I know I've heard many authors say that they can't quite actually write about COVID or incorporate it into literature because it's too timely and too present. We're still living it. So how do you examine something that you're currently living in? So let's go back to the beginning. So let's go back to the beginning of Patient Zero. How did you come up with this idea? You said that you wanted to kind of spin off of Quackery. And I know that, you know, Lydia, you're a doctor, and Nate, you are a librarian, a historian. You're both really research people. That's kind of your thing. So how do you co-write a book then? Do you take one chapter at a time? Do you have Nate do lots of the research and then one of you writes? How is it that you actually co-write a book together?
Yeah, so it's maybe hopefully not something that's immediately apparent when you're reading the book, but we alternate chapters. So we kind of carve out an outline and we discuss what topics we want to cover. So in this case, that's like mostly what diseases we want to cover. And then we split those up between who wants to work on what. And then of course, there's a lot of a lot of back and forth throughout that process. So, we're reading each other's drafts, we're exchanging ideas, we're suggesting, we push the narrative in certain directions at certain points. And over time, having collaborated together now for years, we're pretty good at creating a unified voice, so that hopefully anyway isn't immediately apparent, and as the reader your experience of it as though it's sort of one person telling you these stories. With patient zero, we had the added advantage in a way of also writing about, so we the way the book is kind of set up is you have a variety of history driven narratives that are about an infectious disease and a breakout at a certain point in time. And then we also have a lot of chapters that are about medical advances throughout history as well. And so we could rely on Lydia's extensive background in medicine to lead those more sort of science driven chapters. And then some of the more sort of history driven chapters were ones that I took on in this book.
Yes, so that has worked out really well for us. Ever since we wrote Quackery, just sort of divvying up the chapters and figuring out what we wanted to write has been really fun. And mostly because oftentimes we get to pick the subject matters that we like the best. So I remember when we were writing Quackery, Nate was like, I would like to take the chapter on alcohol, being an aficionado of certain, specialty beers. Not that that actually had a whole lot to do with the chapter at all, but the background part of it was like very fascinating for him, so, and I wanted to do the chapter on corpse and cannibalism medicine because I thought that was super fascinating and gory and weird. So with patient zero, we kind of did the same thing and sort of zipped it along the places where we had our own strengths, and it worked out really great, I think.
So speaking of, is there a story or an aspect of the book that you just loved? You loved the way it came out, or you loved the research you got to do, or you thought you'd take it one place and it turned into something different? What's like your favorite part of the book?
That is a good question. Do I have a favorite part of the book? I have like multiple favorite parts of the book. Like I don't think there's one chapter that I'm like, this is definitely my favorite. Maybe Nate has one. Do you have a favorite chapter?
I mean, I think in terms of like the book itself, and this is typical of Workman's products. So Workman is the publisher that we worked with both for Quackery and for Patient Zero, but they produce just sort of beautiful books, just as physical objects. And one of my favorite parts of the book is how it's designed as well as the illustration of it. Like there's lots of excellent, really interesting vintage photographs that are interlaid into the text and that kind of thing. And I think it makes for a really compelling reading experience. So that's one of my favorite things about the book is like literally the book itself. But in terms of chapters and topics, I think for me, rabies was a favorite one to write about. So I wrote the rabies one, and I just like if you can admire a virus, I admire the rabies virus because it's a kind of a perfect virus for accomplishing what it wants to accomplish in the world, which is not what we want from it. It's really good at it. So it's a really scary virus and a really horrific virus for animals or people that catch that, of course. But speaking from the virus's perspective, it's enormously effective at what it does, and its lethality rate is extraordinary. At one point in time, and relatively recently, really in history, it was like a guaranteed death sentence. If you got rabies, you were going to die, which is astounding, right? And yet even though it's like for sure going to kill its host, rabies had perfected its ability to transfer itself to a new host right before that person dies. And so like the ways that your body responds to rabies sort of like create these opportunities. So like, for example, if you're suffering from rabies, you have a crippling fear of water and you can't drink anything. And then in turn, your mouth will fill with rabies virus, and that's the foaming at the mouth part, right? And then you're like rife for oral spread of that disease, and of course the added bonus, quote unquote, from the perspective of rabies is that your mental capacities are driven in a completely new direction, right? So like suddenly you're inhibited in a lot of areas that you would normally be inhibited in. So the aggression that goes with rabies and so on allows that virus to then pass on to other people or to other animals, typically through violent acts. So it's pretty incredible and like horrific. And I'm just sort of astounded at rabies. So for me, that was a favorite.
Yeah, I think like one of the little snippets that I thought was super fascinating was because I wrote the chapter on the bubonic plague, and I wrote a little sidebar on the origins of or whether or not that sing song "Ring Around the Rosie" that we used to always sing when we were little kids, whether it truly actually has to do with the plague. Because when I was growing up, after singing it as a little kid, at some point in time, somebody said to me, "You know, that's about the plague. You know, ring around the rosies. Those are like the skin rashes that they get, and you know, ashes, ashes. Those are the bodies being burned because everybody's dying. And you know, during this is like the Middle Ages, and then we all fall down. It's like everybody dies. What's the other one? Pocket full of posies is you're carrying flowers in your pocket because of the stench of corpses around. And it turns out that that's not true. Like the Ring Around the Rosie song has nothing to do with the plague. That definition of it showed up sometime in the last century. And the rhyme actually exists well before that. And at the origins of the rhyme, when it's first mentioned, there's no discussion whatsoever about it having to do with anything. They think it has some sort of pagan connections to, like instead of ashes, it might have been achu, might have been sneezes, and bowing, like we all fall down might be we was curtsying. So it's not really plague related, but I had so much fun looking into that one and trying to find out if that was really true.
That's kind of a great like myth busting that you've done. I know that Quackery did a lot of that. You know, the best ways to cure anything was a lot of snake oil, literally and figuratively. Is there something else in your research that you found surprising, something that much like that kind of spun the narrative that you had in your head and that you were excited to share with other people because it could potentially, you know, rewrite some of this misinformation that had been previously floating around?
I think for me, so there were two chapters that I wrote. One was on the origins of HIV, and one was on the origins of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And I would say, hands down, they were the two most difficult chapters for me to write, aside from COVID, just because there was an enormous quantity of information available about both of those. And the way it unfolds in the book, as I wrote it, it's really just like a mystery. You're like starting with, you've got the disease, and then time goes by and you're trying to figure out, well, where did it come from? And all these people have put out all these different theories, and I had to debunk all them like sort of systematically. And so that was really, really fascinating. The HIV chapter in particular was interesting to me because I was working in a hospital in the early 1990s when HIV and AIDS was still very much, really, really active. It was still, sort of considered a death sentence at the time. And it made, sometimes practicing medicine on wards, a little nerve-wracking because you just wanted to make sure you're taking good care of people. So it was, for me, historically, and in my own personal life, it was interesting to research. And then I've just always been fascinated with the 1918 influenza pandemic since I was a kid because it would show up in like my children's books and stuff like that. So I loved writing that chapter. That was really fascinating.
Yeah, I think in terms of a myth that I was surprised at that was debunked in the course of researching this book, for me, it's the one about smallpox blankets. So that's commonly bandied around as sort of this like thing that happened that was really horrible and contributed to the demise of the indigenous peoples of America. Like that white settlers at various points in the Western expansion purposely distributed blankets infested with smallpox to wipe out native inhabitants of an area. So that actually isn't true, which was actually kind of a surprise, with one small exception. So, and I can tell you the quick story around that. But only once in recorded history did smallpox blankets be distributed knowingly by a party to another party, and it was in the late 18th century, and it was by British soldiers that were stationed at a fort in what's now America, in Fort Pitt, so Pittsburgh area, and they did distribute some blankets from a ward in the fort that had a smallpox outbreak as part of trade goods to native tribes in the area who were attacking the fort as well. So there was kind of like this attempt at negotiation, and they gave them these blankets. But so it didn't work. Like the blankets, that's not like how smallpox works. Like you can't. Like that's another thing that was kind of interesting about it. So like 3-day old smallpox blankets will not in turn give you smallpox, right? So the whole thing kind of happened just once, and then it didn't really work, and it sort of blew up though as this sort of myth, right? Because it ties into really true horrific things that did happen, right? Like, like one of the reasons I think that myth had such resonance with people is because smallpox was introduced, into the indigenous population by the European colonization effort, and did wipe out, I mean, just horrific swaths of people. Like 90% essentially of the indigenous American population was taken out by the introduction of European diseases, and most of the death toll came from smallpox. So obviously that's horrific, and there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to talk about and deal with there. But at the same time, the notion of people going around intentionally handing out smallpox blankets was verifiably false. So that was interesting to me too.
And then I should probably mention, after talking about those two chapters, I didn't actually bring up anything interesting about those. So I was like, oh, I didn't answer the question at all. Sorry about that, Paige. So interesting piece of information from the HIV chapter is that even though a lot of people think that HIV started up, kind of just popped onto the scene in the 1980s, geneticists and past research has basically pointed to HIV jumping from most likely a chimpanzee or some other primate to a human being in around 1908, which is a long time ago. So that's interesting. And then in the influenza chapter, I think probably most people are unaware of the fact that most people know, hopefully, that the 1918 so-called Spanish influenza was one of the most deadly influenza pandemics. It was killing many millions of people, more than actually World War I killed. And for some reason, it was particularly deadly. Normally when the flu hits, you get a lot of young people, like young babies and children dying, and you get a lot of elderly dying, because their immune systems aren't as strong as people who are adults and middle and young aged, right? But for some reason in the influenza pandemic, the death curve was sort of a W shape. And the reason for that is that there were people in the middle who were relatively young adults, sort of in their 20s and early 30s, who were dying at a really, really huge rate and very, very quickly. And, when you think of the flu, you think of coughing and you can't breathe very well, but people would be like, bleeding out of their orifices. Their faces were turning kind of purple from not being able to breathe. It was really horrific. So researchers have for a long time been trying to figure out why that virus was so bad. And so in order to try to figure it out, they decided to dig it up from the permafrost in Alaska, as well as from deceased soldiers from the time, and try to reconstruct the virus. So they did. They reconstructed the 1918 influenza virus, which is kind of a really scary thought. It was done in a really top secret, highly secure place. There was one researcher that was tasked with doing the actual major reconstructive part, and they gave the virus to mice to see what would happen, because when they had researched the virus before, all the little bits and pieces of the genome, they're just like, well, there's nothing in here that looks particularly different or weird that would make it so bad. But when it was all put together and it was given to mice, the mice got super sick compared to regular flu viruses. So it was sort of like this weird combination of all the different qualities of those little bits of that genome that made it really, really deadly. But I hadn't known before I did the research that they had actually reconstructed the virus. So that I thought was pretty freaky.
Yeah, that seems like some Jurassic Park stuff right there that I'm getting flashbacks from. So that's fascinating and very spooky. So it's interesting that I was not aware that the Spanish influenza killed more people than even World War II. Because for me, when I hear 1918, my mind goes, oh, well, we've taken care of that. It's past. And things like polio, smallpox, the same thing happens. I think, oh, well, we have vaccines for that. It's gone in modern world, in my world. So I don't really have to worry about that, right? But that's not true for most parts of the world. And also, we do have vaccines now that have quote unquote eradicated many of these diseases. But what other diseases do you find that we could learn from? How do we take the history and how do we learn from that history and bring it forward so that we don't just brush off these major advancements that science has actually made? Can you talk a little bit about that? You said that there were components in there of like the advancements of modern medicine. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Oh, Lydia, you're muted.
It's interesting because there really only has been one major pandemic disease that has been eradicated, and that's smallpox. And so we tend to think, there's a lot of them that are gone, right? So polio and measles and tuberculosis and all these sort of things, they just are not in our day-to-day life. We don't think about it that much. Polio was something that happened to a completely different generation. But even though we have a really effective vaccine, a couple of vaccines, the polio virus is still alive and well in parts of the world. And I think that's shocking for people to hear. So we talk about that in the book. Measles also, you like in the news, maybe not right now, but in the last decade, there was news every year if there's a little measles outbreak at Disney World or Disneyland, or it's shown up in this little community, and there's some people who are unvaccinated, and it's affecting that small population of people. So I think one of the things that we've learned as far as advancements is that we can be really good at getting close to eradicating things, but that some of the things that are preventing us from completely eradicating them are public health measures, are the fact that there are huge disparities in our culture, in not just in the United States, but globally. So some countries that just don't have the capacity to buy vaccines, to distribute vaccines, to educate their citizens, to understand how they work and to get them. And so a lot of the, I think, scientific advancements are at odds with the state of the world and the personal, both individual and societal sort of mores that exist. They're sort of sometimes at odds. So public health isn't always the thing that works well in all societies, even though we all have the best of intentions.
Yeah, I think, oh, sorry, were you going to say something, Paige? You good? I think the smallpox thing is really amazing to me, because smallpox, going back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, smallpox is just a wildly deadly and contagious disease. And so it's kind of this astounding accomplishment that we, speaking as a species, were able to eradicate that in the 1970s. In fact, kind of tying this back into the book, one of the chapters in the book kind of reverses the patient zero lens, and it's about the last person to get a disease. It's about in this case, the last person to get smallpox, who was a medical photographer named Janet Parker, who caught smallpox in Birmingham, England in the late 1970s. 2 years after it had already been declared officially eradicated. The reason she could still catch it is because, and this kind of speaks to what Lydia was talking about earlier with reviving the 1918 flu virus, right? So the reason Janet could catch smallpox is because smallpox, while officially eradicated, still exists in laboratory facilities around the world. And in her case, it was in a lab in England. And to this day, it's a little bit confusing, a little bit up for debate what exactly happened. But one way or another, she was exposed to smallpox and died. Right. I mean, and it was a huge like global moment when that happened for everyone to kind of pause and freak out at the same time, because suddenly it was like, oh my God, is smallpox back? Because it's so hugely contagious and so hugely deadly. So thankfully that outbreak was super quickly contained and it didn't spread any further. So Janet's mother caught it and Janet herself died, but that was it. They managed to contain it at that point, which is super impressive. But yeah, I mean, now, as you fast forward a little bit further in time, the fact that we even got to that point where smallpox was officially eradicated is enormous. I mean, that's an enormous accomplishment, going from a disease that probably single-handedly wiped out the vast majority of the indigenous population of both North and South America, 4 centuries later is effectively gone, and that's pretty incredible. So.
Yeah, there's so many different developments that happened that we found in our research that we completely take for granted. I mean, we talk about wearing masks and things like that, and but there was a very decided history to how they were created and when they started getting used, and some of the fighting that happened, with mask mandates in 1918, that happened back then as well. But like one interesting little tidbit about the N95 mask, which 3 years ago, nobody would know exactly what an N95 mask, and now everybody knows what an N95 mask is. But it wasn't until the 1950s that somebody helped to create that. It actually came from a woman who's working at House Beautiful magazine, and she was asked by the 3M company to work on these polymers to make bendable ribbons or different kinds of ribbons. And they came out making these sort of foam materials. And she thought, oh, these would be great bra cups, or these would be great shoulder pads for women's clothing. A couple of years later, after she had some family members in the hospital, she was like, why aren't there better masks? Like, people just don't have good masks. And she was thinking about this material and worked again with 3M. And it turns out that they were able to put together the creation of what ended up becoming the modern N95 mask, which came from kind of an idea that was pretty similar to the bra cup. So that was really fun to find out. And that kind of ingenuity, I think, really speaks to how humans are so good at figuring things out and making things better. And I myself have been just astonished at how quickly vaccines have come, how there are home COVID tests. I have one like literally sitting on my floor over there. We don't have home flu tests. We don't have home tests like that for a whole lot of other things. For something this momentous, as far as what's affecting our population. So little things like that and big things like that have been just really eye-opening for me to experience just as a person, but also looking back in time and seeing these small but also enormous steps along the way that have changed so many things.
That's brilliant. Definitely seeing what can happen when people really put their minds to it and come together. And there's also that flip side of it too. You said something there, Lydia, about how ingenious people are, how much ingenuity the human mind is capable of. And I'm going to turn it back around to our Jurassic Park here. We also are curious creatures who keep smallpox in labs in England and accidentally release it. So can you tell me, just you two personally, just not even potentially as authors, but just what you think philosophy-wise, what is our responsibility around things like keeping smallpox in labs or keeping what would become COVID in a lab in China and waiting to reveal it? What is our personal responsibility as humans who are the most evolved creatures on this earth? What's our responsibility there around these deadly diseases that we have eradicated and that we're keeping under control? How do we put our ingenuity to the best use when we're talking about these huge ideas like life and death, holding things in our hands? What do you think about that?
That's a good question. Nate, any thoughts? I have a couple of ideas, but
Can I play the I'm going to bow out as the historian card and have the scientists answer this?
you can. Let me see. So a couple of things on that. Like, first of all, the whole idea that like, we're keeping smallpox in, in freezers someplace, there is an international agreement that it's only supposed to exist in like two places. And like one is like the CDC and the other places, I think it's in Russia. Is that right, Nate? It's in the book, but it keeps showing up in the news. It showed up in the news twice, I think, in the last like year or two, that somebody's cleaning out an old fridge in like one wing of like this building that's part of the CDC, and they're like, "Oh, there's a smallpox file in here, and we didn't realize it. And I was about to defrost it and chuck it in the trash." So that's really frightening, right? Those mistakes, because it makes sense for us to eliminate the possibility that we're going to make a human mistake and release it. On the other hand, we make human mistakes all the time. So even if we had the best of intentions, I feel like this kind of stuff is going to happen. On top of that, there's also the fact that we have been changing our world in so many different ways, specifically with like global warming. And so, there's always this fear that something is going to melt in the permafrost and release. So something that even though we didn't have, any control over, shows up anyway, right? So that there have been some documented cases of some old viruses being found in carcasses in melted permafrost in Siberia. And so that is a real thing. So I think that the idea that we have full control over this is faulty. I think that we can do the best, and that's worth doing. But one, mistakes are still going to happen despite our best intentions. And then number two, there is the fact that science is still advancing so quickly that we can, I guess you have smallpox around just in case it shows up again, and you need to compare it to the old genome. Well, we have that genome all sequenced already, and we can sequence a new one very quickly. And that's not necessarily going to prevent us from making a new vaccine if we need to. So the whole thing is just it's not exactly clear. I think it's almost nostalgia that we're keeping it around. But my guess is that chances are if we eliminate it completely, it's still in somebody's freezer somewhere anyway.
Nate, a historian, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that was an extremely well put answer, Lydia. So yeah, but yeah, it is. I guess I'll just use it as a segue to just mention, one with the permafrost issue that Lydia raised, and tying that into something we talked about in the book, which was anthrax. So this is something else that happened relatively recently with reindeer carcasses that were in the permafrost, and as a result of global warming, the permafrost layer kind of melting away and these carcasses kind of coming back up to the surface. Well, these reindeer had died from anthrax, and anthrax is super scary because there's like extraordinarily small amount of it can do a huge amount of damage to quite a large area. So if anthrax spores, you don't even have to do plural. If an anthrax spore is released somewhere, like the potential for havoc is like really high. So that was super scary, like just the possibility, right? And luckily, like nothing really came out of that, but scientists and the world were kind of teetering on the edge there for a little bit, about what might happen. And right, like who knows? There's always a variety of unintended consequences of anything, and this is just, like the world's an uncertain place. The world's a dangerous place. Like it's never going to be a safe place, right? And that's like what Lydia said, like we might officially have eliminated smallpox, and then a janitor throws away a vial of smallpox, and then there's a huge outbreak in some random city, right? And we start all over again, right? So I don't know. That doesn't really provide us with a great direction, besides just to say, let's all just keep on moving forward and doing the best we can, right?
That is a great motto. Let's just stick that up on some billboards. We could use more of those. So that's kind of a good segue. So this book is a little heavy, the world's deadliest diseases, the biggest catastrophes. Was there anything that you found in the writing of the book that you came to celebrate or appreciate more in contrast to the material you were working on?
That is a good question. I would say, I don't know. I think in every single chapter there was something that really that I thought was just pretty ingenious and pretty awesome. Like in the vaccine chapter, just the development of the vaccine was just really interesting because way back when, before, a vaccine is when you actually put something into your body that is not the actual disease itself, but is close enough or parts of it or mimics it so that your body makes has an immune response so that when the real thing comes, you can attack it and send it on its way. But before that, there was something called variolation, which is they gave you the actual disease, but in a teeny tiny amount, and it would give you the disease, but you wouldn't get as sick, and then you would have immunity. And that's what they were doing with smallpox. I'm sorry, I know we're talking a lot about smallpox, but it's a big disease, and it does come up like throughout history. But in the vaccine world, and as far as vaccine origins, it is a huge, huge player. And so, so just the idea that they could figure out that, like, oh, if you give a little crust of somebody's old smallpox scab and you inhale it, sorry, I'm so sorry. Are you all eating dinner? I'm so sorry. Or if you just take a little bit of smallpox like liquid from like one of the like the vesicles, like the little pustules, and then you scratch that into the skin of a little kid and it gives them, that's not any better. I'm so sorry. I'm still doing it. It's so gross. But that's how they would give people like a tiny dose of smallpox. And the person would get like, a couple of lesions instead of like a full face of lesions. And then they would be protected forever. And at some point in time, there were two men actually who discovered that, hey, how come milkmaids with like beautiful skin, like they never get smallpox? And it was because they were occasionally getting exposed to something called cowpox, which is a cow version of it. And they would get maybe a couple of little like, things on their arms where they were, milking. And they both of these men simultaneously had an idea like, well, what if we take a little bit of that and scratch that liquid from like a cowpox blister into a person, and would it protect them against smallpox? And it did. And it was such a brilliant idea. That's why the word vaccine actually comes from the Latin, I think it's Latin root vacca, which means cow. So we're all talking about like our cow vaccines, which is really funny, but nobody realizes that it's actually from the cow. But it was a brilliant idea. And of course, those two men were completely ridiculed, laughed at. Part of that is because of money, which is really interesting because there were so many other physicians at that time who were doing variolation. So they were taking the crusts of people who had like old smallpox and they were giving it to people and scratching them up to give them, the smaller version of smallpox. And these people come along and say, you don't have to do that. You don't have to even give them smallpox. You could just give them cowpox, which isn't deadly at all. And you'll get just like you get one blister in the place where I scratch you. That's it. And you're protected. And so all the people who are making money off of variolation got really, really mad. And they said, these people are quacks and don't listen to them. But it did catch on. And it became the first smallpox vaccine. Interestingly enough, they kept using that same virus, that cowpox virus, in smallpox vaccines. But at some point in time, over the course of the next couple of decades, it changed and it is no longer the same virus. It is complete. It's called vaccinia virus. It's like a different one now. I don't know how, we don't know exactly how it happened, but that vaccine that is used for smallpox, which is rarely used these days, but it's still around, is different from the original cowpox that Edward Jenner and Benjamin Jesty used way back then. But I think I completely forgot your question. I just went off on a tangent talking about vaccines and how cool it is, because it was, every chapter is like that, where there's something in there that you're just like, this is so fascinating. This is so cool. This is so interesting. And yeah, I would just totally light up and it would make me really happy because I just loved being able to see those sort of ingenious moments or those little bits of history that most people don't really get to know about. And honestly, most doctors, we don't learn about this in medical school. we learn about how vaccines work, but we don't get a history on them. So for me, it was just enlightening just every step of the way. I just loved it.
Yeah, I think for me, I really enjoy connecting to the human element, to the stories that are told throughout time. And I think that's something we kind of got to play around with Patient Zero, which I think we both enjoyed. So the concept of Patient Zero itself is, it's a bit fraught, and it can lead to a bit of finger pointing, right, around sort of like how a disease starts and what person or what cultural group we blame for that, when disease really is something that affects all of us. And I thought one of the things that was sort of interesting and revealing to me doing the research was that the humanizing of people that have been in that role at certain points in time. And Lydia talked about that a little bit earlier with HIV, and then for a chapter that I wrote about, which was typhoid and the Typhoid Mary situation, in the sort of series of typhoid outbreaks that happened in early 20th century New York City that were traced back to her. But and while that is true, and while it is like something that did verifiably happen in history, there's a lot more to that story. And as a person and alive at a unique moment in time, as a Irish immigrant at a time with high anti-Irish sentiment in New York City, as someone that was lower down on the economic scale and was struggling to kind of stitch together steady work, there's a lot of complexity to that story. And I enjoyed being able to tell that story and to broaden the view, right, of like what we think of when we think of Typhoid Mary. So yeah, I thought that was a revealing part too. And it makes me happy that we as a culture at a spot in time too, where we're getting better about how we talk and think about these things. So I appreciated that.
Yes, that humanizing quality, I think is what you said. That's fantastic. And I do remember you mentioned earlier about the politicization of some of like vaccines and some of these elements that are then disproportionately pushed towards one side or the other. I think Lydia was mentioning it when she was researching COVID and trying to track the sources for everything so that she was getting at the real story and the fact, and sometimes how you have to separate story from fact and tell both sides of it. I think that is really, really well done. Both of you doing an incredible job at that. And I think that is what makes this book so accessible, is that it is in layman's terms and it's stories that are interesting and gruesome. Lydia, it was that was that was great. No, it was brilliant. I loved that. It was visceral, very much, very visceral, and it's an incredible way to really sink in this important part of our history, which is still in some cases ongoing, and just having people walk away having learned something and being able to see a really broad picture of what's going on and what has been. So that was really well done. I want to just take a second to invite our audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. Our authors are here and they are eager to take any questions. I want to just give like an open-ended, Nate, Lydia, is there anything else that you are just wanting to say, dying to say, anything that you wanted to share?
Well, I would just say, as a thank you to Paige and Deschutes Public Library for hosting us. I would just throw that out there because I used to work for Deschutes Public Library, which may be known to folks in the audience or may not be. But at any rate, I was a community librarian with Deschutes Public Library for 7 years, and really enjoyed my time there. It's a great library. It's a great organization. A lot of great people work there, and they do a lot of great things for the community. So I appreciate the opportunity to come back and speak to you all.
And I would say, I guess, just for people who are sort of looking for a ray of hope in this pandemic and looking at this book and saying like, well, isn't there anything else that you can tell us about how things are going to turn out since you see how everything else has turned out? And that would be to just hold on to hope, because I think that we are going to come on the other side of this to a point where we're going to be able to talk about it and it's going to be in the history books. But we just have to sort of one day at a time.
Yes, it's interesting. I think that, Lydia, you have a particularly unique experience of having lived now through working in the wards on HIV, and now working with, I'm not exactly sure if you're working with patients of COVID, but you're surrounded right now. So you're in it again. And so thank you to you and all healthcare professionals for the work that you're doing out there on the front lines with these people, because we could not do this without you. And thank you to our historian also for providing us with, all of the information on how this all started, because we cannot grow unless we learn from our past mistakes. We do have a question that came through, and Christine wanted to know, may have already been asked, but how did you two originally start collaborating?
Well, we started collaborating because, so my wife is a young adult novelist, and Lydia Kang is also a young adult novelist. I don't know why I just threw your last name in there, Lydia. Lydia is also.
That's okay.
and before Lydia started writing nonfiction, they were both published by Penguin Books and on a similar sort of publicity and touring racket together in around 2013, 2014-ish area. Anyway, so we all met at an event. It was Comic-Con down in San Diego, California. I was with my wife at an event, and we were hanging out with Lydia, having lunch, and we all got along famously, and we were having a good time chatting about mutual interests in history, mutual interests in the morbid and the macabre, and think critically, actually, for our collaboration, a similar sense of humor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those attributes all came out in our conversation hanging out at this event. And actually, as my wife suggested at the time, like, you guys should write a book together. And that genesis of that idea was then Quackery, right? So that's where Quackery was born. And then we've had, I feel really lucky to be able to have worked with Lydia on 2 projects now. I think we're a great team, and we're able to collaborate really well. And I don't think that's something everyone gets to say about a co-writer. So I really appreciate that. And it has been a really fruitful partnership.
Yeah, it has. It worked out really, really well. Is Nate's idea. I think Nate, like, it was after that meeting, maybe a couple months went by, and then I got this email, and Nate's just like, let's write a book about quacks, about like quack doctors and like, all those people, snake oil salesmen. And I just jumped on it with him because I was like, this is such a great idea. Because as I had mentioned before, I was like, I didn't get any of this. I didn't get any of this history of medicine stuff in school. I got none of it. And so I thought, I could actually look into all this stuff and learn a bunch, and it's going to be so fun and interesting. And this was our first time, actually, maybe not mine, maybe not Nate's, but it was definitely my first time writing nonfiction. And I have this tendency to be like, yeah, I'll just do it. I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I'm going to try anyway. And let's just sort of see how it goes. And we did, and it worked. So it's what happens when you have we just had a good synergy of working together, and a topic and topics, I should say, that have just been really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and we have a couple more ideas coming down the pipeline. I think that we're excited to, I actually just recently moved to Georgia. I'm now in Savannah, Georgia, and have started up a new position down here. So, but once my life settles down a little bit, and Lydia catches up with a couple of our other writing projects, we hope to start the next collaboration too.
Yep.
Good. That was my next question. What are you working on next? Because your adoring fans would love to know.
We have some ideas. We need to get going on them. And so Nate and I, we probably need to talk soon, but yeah, we always have a couple ideas sort of brewing around. So just stay tuned.
Well, congratulations on the move, Nate. I had misinformation. I had said you were in Portland, but I'm glad to hear that you are a little closer to your writing partner. I hope that will, selfishly, I hope that means that the next one will come out faster. So And I just want to say that you two definitely seem like a cohesive unit. Anyone who has read your work or had the pleasure of listening to any of your talks or anything knows that you two do seem like a unified voice. If one didn't know that these are two individual authors kind of alternating chapters, you really would not be able to tell. And I think that that's one of the elements of your work that I find so comforting and fascinating, is that it does feel like somebody is sitting next to me telling me the worst story I've ever heard about how these people all died in these terrible ways. And I love it. It's a very macabre bedtime story, but I think it does it really, really well. So thank you so much for sharing your talents with us tonight, and also for sharing your talents with us in the literary realm. And I cannot wait to see what you come up with next. So please, the second that you do, let us know. I'll be one of your beta readers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. And thank you for doing programs like this and just keeping the library healthy and alive and continuing. So we always appreciate doing library stuff with you guys. Good.
One day, hopefully not too far into the future, we will be able to host you again in person, see everyone again in person. But until then, I'll say thank you so much for sharing your time. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for being with us here tonight. And I hope that all of you will check out Patient Zero, A History of the World's Deadliest Diseases. It's available at your Deschutes Public Library. And so too is Quackery, the very first book by this dynamic duo. You can find all of those at deschuteslibrary.org. And so check out those. And also Lydia's works are available in our catalog too. So check out some of her YA literature. It's a really good combination of talents there. So please check all of that out. And until then, I will say good night to everyone, and I hope to see you again very soon.
Thanks so much,
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.